And we'll begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Aurelia Maraca. I'm the Technology Program Coordinator at the Danbury Library, and I welcome you to this special presentation that's part of our ALA Resilient Communities grant that the library has received. So, we're going to be talking about Danbury and the climate crisis. So just a brief, message just to let you know that the library has reopened this week with limited services. So you can actually come into the library and browse around. You can also make computer appointments and also do some photocopying. We are continuing our curbside service. So if you want to pick up some books without going inside the library, we are still doing that. Just go to danburylibrary.org and you can click on the little section that says curbside service if you want to learn more if you don't know anything about that. So just to introduce our panel for this evening, we have John O'Donnell from the Danbury Museum. He's also a former Danbury librarian. He was going to provide historical and local context of extreme weather events in Danbury with a focus on the Great Flood of 1955. And following John, we have Gary Lesser. He's assistant to the Director of Meteorological Studies at Western Connecticut State University and its Weather Center. And he's going to speak about forecasting weather patterns and how climate change has impacted extreme weather conditions. And we also have Matthew Casavecchia. He's a part of the City of Danbury's Emergency Management and Emergency Medical Services Office, and he's the director of that office. And he's going to present how the City of Danbury is prepared to handle such extreme weather events and what residents can do to prepare themselves in case of an emergency. And afterwards, we're going to actually have some time for questions and answers. So please keep your microphones and your cameras off. And if you have a question after all three presenters have presented, please type it in the chat and I will relay those questions in turn to each of the presenters. And so I guess that's all I have to say. Just to let you know, thank you for joining us on this little rainy evening. And we thank the Friends of the Danbury Library for making this program possible. So I think I've spoken enough. I'd like to turn things over to John O'Donnell of the Danbury Museum. Thank you, John, for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Aurelio, for the introduction. I think it's a very important topic that we're dealing with tonight, and especially climate change linked to resilient communities. And it's not only historical, I'll be talking about the historical part of it, but it's an issue that is pressing on us today. And I just want to start by reading you something from the news on Monday online. And this is about the flooding in Australia, which is catastrophic flooding as well. The huge rainfalls have been driven by two weather systems colliding, a slow-moving coastal trough and the approach of another system coming through from the west is pumping down tropical moisture into the state, which is then being whipped up by strong easterly winds. Residents have been urged to monitor the weather warnings and heed the advice of emergency services. Since Thursday, the State Emergency Service has responded to 8,000 calls for assistance, according to the Premier of the New South Wales area. Thousands of emergency workers and volunteers are on the ground helping trapped residents. Overnight, residents in Kempsey were told to evacuate as the Maclay River is expected to burst its banks. The town is currently split in two by the floodwaters, and there is no access to the city center. Now, you'll hear more about something like that, but in reference to Danbury shortly when we get into the presentation. And I'd like to start out by talking about the vagaries of New England weather, how changeable it is. Let me quote Mark Twain, who was a weather authority, and I hadn't realized this until I started researching the program. And he was speaking to the New England Society in New York City. He was replying to a toast, the oldest inhabitant, the weather of New England. And he said, "I reverently believe that the maker who made us all makes everything in New England but the weather. I don't know who makes that, but it must be raw apprentices in the weather clerk's factory who experiment and learn how in New England for board and clothes, and then are promoted to make weather for countries that require a good article and will take their custom elsewhere if they don't get it. There is a sumptuousness about the New England weather that compels the stranger's admiration and regret. The weather is always doing something there, always attending strictly to business, always getting up new designs and trying them out on the people to see how they will go. And that's the end of the quote. And Twain knew New England weather intimately, having lived in Hartford and Reading for extended periods of time. I have lived in New England for 35 years and would completely agree with Twain's analysis. There is another weather adage about New England, about looking out the window and the weather will immediately change. I'm very pleased tonight to be able to talk to you about the vagaries of New England weather and about several events in the history of Danbury which illustrate these vagaries and dangers of New England weather. I will look at two prior events in Danbury that eerily mirrored what would happen in the floods of October 1955. The first one I would like to mention is the failure of the Cohanza dams. The Cohanza Reservoir was built in 1860 in order to supply sufficient water to the growing hatting factories in Danbury. Hatting was the preeminent industry in Danbury from the late 18th century until well into the 20th century. The residents of Danbury worked together and built two earthen dams, which were known as the Upper and Lower Cohanza Dams, named for the Cohanza Brook that flowed from the reservoir into the heart of Danbury 2 miles away. In late 1868, a slight crack was discovered in the upper dam, but no action was taken to repair it. On the frigid evening of January 31st, 1869, the residents of Danbury would pay a horrible price for neglecting this repair. The upper dam collapsed under the pressure of the ice-choked body of water it was designed to hold back. The wall of icy water hurtled toward the unsuspecting residents of downtown Danbury and destroyed both the upper and the lower dams. The tragedy drew national news coverage. The following description is from an article in Harper's Weekly. With terrible velocity, the floodwaters struck the houses on Main Street near the riverbank, instantly sweeping them from their foundations. The water seethed and roared 15 feet above the bed of the river. The noise of wrecked houses mingled with the screams of drowning men, women, and children, and what the water did not overwhelm was demolished by the rushing ice and timber. Fatalities were reported as 11 or 13 people killed by the flash flood. Bridges, railroad tracks, and factory buildings were completely destroyed in less than 30 minutes. There was a long and painful rebuilding process after the almost biblical destruction of this flood. The dams were rebuilt, albeit on a smaller scale. This event is indicative of a constant theme throughout Danbury history. This is the resilience of the residents of Danbury to respond and recover quickly from disasters. On the Great Seal of the city, there are elm trees which graced Main Street, and below the trees, there are waters symbolizing this flood. There is a Latin motto, Restituimus, we have restored, which Danbury definitely had done. There is a second Latin motto on the seal, Perege modo, let us go forward. The citizens of Danbury would need their resilience and mottos when they were again assaulted and challenged by New England weather. Another important event which preceded the floods of 1955 was the hurricane of 1938. It began on September 18th. In a precursor of what happened in Danbury in 1955, persistent prior rains had soaked New England and rivers overflowed their banks. This hurricane was the greatest natural disaster in this area. It killed more than 600 people and injured more than 30,000 people and left 100,000 people homeless. The eastern half of Connecticut suffered the most devastation from the storm, but Danbury was by no means left unscathed. The Still River, as it would in 1955, overflowed its banks. It knocked down trees, but not entire neighborhoods as it did elsewhere. Trees were down all over Main Street, and White Street was flooded by the Still River. The News Times wrote that Danburyans are unanimous in saying that they never hoped to have such an experience as the eastern side of the state had suffered. However, they would face a similar crisis with the onset of the 1955 flood. Their resilience and restoration powers would be sorely tested yet again. In 1955, Danbury was subjected to an intense amount of heavy rain. August 19th, 1955, saw the arrival of Hurricane Diane, and she pounded the region. The event was followed on October 16th and 17th by Hurricane Katie, which again soaked the ground and already saturated rivers. This disaster in 1955 left the city of 35,000 people at that time with millions of dollars in damages, as the waters of the Still River yet again bashed their way through homes, factories, stores, offices, and heaved up roads, bridges, and railroad tracks and equipment as if they were toys. This disaster would finally force the city to seek a lasting solution to the Still River problem, and would finally be confined and contained within its banks. The Still River was at the heart of both of these disasters. In the downtown area of Danbury, the growing city encroached on the river by extending building foundations and sewer and water lines into the riverbed. These factors would make the problems much worse for the citizens of Danbury. On August 18th and 19th, Hurricane Diane dumped more than 5 inches of rain on the city, bringing the monthly total to 15 inches. The August flooding caused $3 million in damages in the downtown area. Downtown merchants suffered severely because of this. Their stores were damaged and flooded, but on top of that, their inventories were likewise damaged, and much of it had to be thrown away. But the corporations in Danbury were struck in a very harmful manner as well. I will use the Barden Corporation, which made ball bearings, as an example. Approximately 300 machines and 1,000 electric motors had to be rebuilt. $50,000 worth of gauges were brought by boat to Henry Abbott Technical School, where employees worked around the clock to clean and dry them. Additionally, it was necessary to use 5 fire engines to pump out their building before employees could begin cleaning the interior floors and walls. The factory was inoperable for 3 weeks. But the August damage was merely a prelude to the more serious damage which was wreaked upon the city by the second storm in October. The preliminary bout was over, and now came the main event. Heavy rain started to fall on October 13th. On October 15th, 4.5 inches of rain had fallen, which was close to the whole amount during the August disaster. Now the storm worsened, and the Still River burst its banks yet again, but with even more force than in August. When the rain finally ceased on Monday morning, a staggering total of 12 inches of rain had fallen on Danbury in 4 days. The city had suffered the worst flood in its history. The flood was unprecedented in the damage that it caused. The city was rent in two, as happened in Australia, as we talked about at the beginning. Transportation of every kind was brought to a standstill. All of the bridges over the river were damaged. There was no power for 3 days because the Triangle Street substation was flooded and was taken offline. The city merchants, as they had in the August flooding, suffered incredible damage on an even graver scale. This is illustrated by the experience of Ralph Urban, who owned an appliance store on White Street. He measured 69 inches of water in his store as compared to 24 inches in the August storm. The Main and White Street merchants used hoses to clean silt from merchandise in an attempt to salvage some of their inventories. But the losses in October were worse. In Connecticut Hardware on White Street, Lou Ginsburg found a fish 4 feet above the floor in his display window. Most of his stock was damaged. Like most of his fellow store owners, he threw a post-flood sidewalk sale, even though most of the sidewalk had gone in the flood. Factories were again severely damaged by the flood. Walls at the American Hatters and Furriers factory and the Mallory Hat factory collapsed and were turned to rubble. Additionally, Mallory workers were forced to throw out hundreds of damaged hat boxes and racks of hats. George Crezon, who worked on the packing department, remembered that the river had been nearly dry in July. It was hard to believe that water was 4 feet deep inside the plant 2 months later. The Barden Corporation again had to dry out its delicate machinery and yet again do an interior cleanup of the factory building. One of the workers who was involved in the cleanup was quoted in the News Times as follows: "It was cold, damp, dirty, and it stunk in there. Some workers went home and just threw their clothes out." Also from the article was an interview with Norma Mullins, who worked in the Barden cafeteria washing silverware. As she worked, she kept a watchful eye out for rats. And she said, "Oh, I was deathly afraid of rats," she was quoted as saying. She didn't see any, but when all of the cleaning in the cafeteria was done, state health officials arrived and said it wasn't good enough. Mullins and the rest of the crew had to sterilize everything. Tons of chloride of lime, a disinfectant, were trucked into Danbury and distributed to businesses. Workers were given shots to prevent outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Health officials advised the city population to boil the water 5 minutes before consuming it. Workers for the Housatonic Public Service worked shifts as long as 20 hours per day in order to restore power and to clean the Triangle Street substation. The October flood caused an estimated $6 million in damages. Downtown Danbury resembled a war zone. The National Guard was called in. The only vehicles capable of movement in the inundated streets were large dump trucks. Danbury's supply was augmented by the arrival of 22 fire trucks from New York City to assist in rescue efforts. These trucks were able to evacuate people marooned in their homes and apartments. A 13-year-old boy named Eugene Ward was rescued by an Army helicopter rescue team from a rooftop on Main Street. The helicopter team had also helped to rescue passengers on a Saturday night train from New York City. The train stalled near Cannondale for 12 hours before the copter was able to start the rescue effort. In repeated trips, the crew rescued 85 people and 6 crewmen from the train. There were fatalities as well. Patrolman Thomas Keating suffered a fatal heart attack while attempting to rescue people from the raging waters. Christopher Wheeler's body was found after the waters receded, partially buried by mud and debris near the Chestnut Street Bridge. A Reading man was killed when his car was swept off the road by the immense power of the water. His wife had tried to save herself by clinging to a tree for 6 hours. As the rescuers were 20 feet away, she was unable to keep holding on and let go and was swept away and died in the raging waters. Amidst the tragedy, there were moments of joy as well. Edith Dyke of Ridgefield went into labor on Sunday night at 8 p.m. She had planned on having her children at Danbury Hospital, but that proved to be impossible. So she, her husband, and her father set out for Norwalk Hospital via Lewisboro, New York, which is where their car died in the pouring rain. They stopped at someone's house, and the homeowner was kind enough to drive them to Norwalk Hospital in his own car. They got to the hospital at 11:30 p.m. and had to walk up 4 flights of stairs using flashlights since the hospital was without power. Mrs. Lyle had twins delivered just before midnight by a doctor she was unacquainted with. The news of the births at the height of the floods made national headlines. Mrs. Dyke received congratulatory mail from people all across the country. Meanwhile, in Danbury, the homeless were housed in cots in the War Memorial Building. The Salvation Army and the Red Cross were on hand to render assistance to the people that desperately needed it. Governor Abraham Ribicoff, later a member of President John F. Kennedy's cabinet, visited the city to see the damage firsthand and to talk to residents about their problems and possible solutions and to offer aid and comfort. Recovery efforts began soon after, but the recovery was a lengthy process. The number one issue to be dealt with was the containment of the Still River, which had wreaked havoc on the city multiple times. The founder and president of the Barton Corporation, F.E. Erickson, soon spoke up about the danger that the river posed to the city's economic health. And this is a quote: "If we get another flood, we're through. We can't spend $300,000 on cleanup every 2 months. We can't stay in Danbury." His plea to control the Still River was not ignored. A citizens committee for flood control action was formed and was ultimately successful in solving the problem. The Army Corps of Engineers and the Connecticut State Water Commission were called in. They used federal, state, and Danbury funding and were able to straighten, deepen, and contain with concrete walls the Still River. It was a lengthy process which was completed in several phases, which ultimately took 20 years. But the Still River has never menaced the city again, as it had so many times before, which is not to say that there weren't also floods after that, but they were never as catastrophic as they had been before this work on diverting the Still River. In addition to work with the Still River, there was a huge undertaking of urban renewal in Danbury as well, especially near White Street. And this and the Still River project were massive changes to the outlook of Danbury. Danbury changed completely from these weather events. And I have to say, for the better. You know, it's been much quieter on the weather scene since then. In closing, I just want to share more weather knowledge from Mark Twain with his take on spring in New England. And this is the quotation: "In the spring, I have counted 136 different kinds of weather inside of 24 hours. End of quotation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for providing us with a perspective of Danbury's history and the catastrophic floods that we've gone through. So thank you so much, John. And what we're
Welcome.
right now is we're going to take a moment to transition to Gary. Gary's all set. We're going to make him a co-host, if that's okay, Christina. So
All set.
awesome. So everyone, Professor Gary Lesser of Western Connecticut State University's Weather Center and Meteorological Department.
Thank you, Aurelio. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. You can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just these are a couple pictures from the flooding of Diane and Connie. And some of you, we don't really know who's online, but maybe if you're old enough, on the picture on the left, I never saw that. I'm not quite sure if anybody can chime in as to where that flooding was. The Shell gas station, Edwards restaurant. But on the right, certainly Feinstein's men's clothing. Excuse me, gotta go back. That certainly is pretty shocking from the time that I've actually seen the Feinsteins way back in the 1990s. And also, we had comments from a Joseph Simcoe. Sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of, I can see everybody's pictures here and I can't read it. Okay, so this is from Joseph Simcoe, who was the Danbury weather observer back in 1955, talking about Connie, that Connie passed west of here, causing gale force winds, heavy rains. Damage was mostly to power lines and telephones. Hurricane Diane on the 18th and 19th passed to the east with torrential rains and gale force winds, causing the Still River here to flood. Damage to factories, stores, private homes, roads, bridges, etc. was tremendous. There were no casualties, luckily. However, property damage was estimated to be $3 million. So certainly back then, that was a lot of damage. Nowadays, it'd be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, now for my presentation, the American Library Association, Resilient Communities, Danbury Library. What is climate change? A lot of people, I don't think, really understand exactly what climate change is. It's not something that you can just have a snowstorm and say, climate change is getting colder, or say the Washington, D.C. areas experiencing blizzard conditions, and they don't normally have blizzard conditions. So that doesn't mean that it's climate change. Climate change has to take place over a much larger area, the entire globe. Typically, the most extreme weathers are felt where it's typically the coldest because it ends up being warmer. Here in Connecticut, since 1970, we are 2.8 degrees warmer than we were in the previous decades. The changing climate is likely to be increasing flooding in the greater Danbury area, a greater chance for wildfires. I know I live in central Connecticut, and certainly the wildfire situation is something you can visualize every year. Already this year, I know of at least 2 wildfires in Connecticut. So that's certainly something we have to take into consideration. It's only March. You know, we've just come off of a winter that had in the greater Danbury area about 5 inches more snow than normal. So you wouldn't think you'd be having wildfires so quickly. However, we were also seeing a lot more in the way of gusty winds, damaging winds from storms that come through multiple times this year already. We've had wind gusts that have been over 40, 50 miles per hour. And, you know, if these are at the same time the wildfires, then you're going to end up with more devastating wildfires. It's also going to be harming ecosystems, disrupting farming. Certainly, drought in Connecticut is something that last year affected farming and cut short in many locations. And here in the greater Danbury area, rainfall was much closer to normal, so the impact was less. Another great concern because of the pandemic that we're having now is increased insect outbreaks. You know, insects transmit disease. The more insects, the more potential there is for an outbreak of another disease. And there's also other risks to human health that we have to be concerned with as the climate changes. Okay, so why is the Earth warming? Fossil fuels are one of the major concerns. It releases large amounts of gas into our air, and some of the gases in our atmosphere are naturally occurring and others are not. So by putting more of these gases into the atmosphere, we are creating the perfect condition for creating our own greenhouse effect or trapping heat in to the Earth. And the more carbon dioxide you have, the more likely that you're going to be increasing this level and creating more intense climate warming. In Connecticut, we can expect shorter winters, which I think this year we got through November with a little snow. December was pretty much nondescript. January, the first half, there really wasn't much. Second half, winter kicked in, continued right on through February and early March. And then all of a sudden it was over. And now we're talking potential of record high temperatures tomorrow. So it's certainly something that you can see firsthand for the shorter winters. Now, this is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are taking place across the globe. You can see on the left side, the United States, you know, we're doing 1 million metric tons. This is the measurement, 6,371. Now, as you go to the developing areas like China and India, Combined, they're already 14,000. So you, again, see that their population increases, that's going to be increasing, putting out more stuff, and that's going to create more greenhouse emissions that are going to go all across the globe. You know, once you do something anywhere, eventually, as the air flows across the globe, it has the effect everywhere. And again, the pandemic, you can see things do travel. So we have to keep an eye on everybody. It's not just greater Danbury area, it's the whole world that we're concerned with. Now, one thing that you can see in climate change is the effects on glaciers. You know, glaciers are very large masses of ice. And I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of this glacier. It is in Iceland. As you go from 1999, they have a little marker there. That's where the glacier was. And as you can see over the next few years, it dramatically shifted to the right as the glacier was shrinking. So it's something you can actually measure firsthand. What are glaciers? Again, glaciers are large masses of ice, predominantly in northern areas and southern parts of the globe. They are snow piles that get compressed and hardened into ice. They can flow and they can bend like taffy. And if they are on a mountaintop, they do often flow downhill, which is why you hear about people that are going onto these glaciers sometimes do get killed as they shift. This is the anatomy of a glacier. You have the accumulation zone at the top where the snow gathers and increases, and down at the bottom, the terminus where the glacier's endpoint is. And through time, this glacier does move back and forth. And as it continues to shrink, obviously that is the concern that we have with global warming. Now, the air that we breathe, you can see on the left side, predominantly we have argon, oxygen, and nitrogen in the air. So that's the normal balance in percentages. Right now, 0.03% is carbon dioxide. As that increases, that affects the greenhouse effect, which again traps heat near the surface, making things on Earth hotter. And certainly it's not something that we want to do. The hotter things get, the more uninhabitable they become. So this is our goal, to reduce our carbon dioxide output. Now, weather, which is what I basically do on a daily basis, is the specific state of the atmosphere at a given time, and it changes minute by minute, day by day, and week to week. And as John had said, you have Mark Twain, who said, if you don't like the weather, just wait a minute, it will change. And unfortunately, the pattern has been, yes, it's changing warmer and warmer and warmer, at least on a global basis. There are times in which certain areas of the globe do cool down, and there's other times that they do get warmer. But as the globe on an entirety continues to warm, that is very disconcerting. July 2019 was the hottest month on record across the globe. And you think about it, well, that's really not all that impressive. You know, 1 year, big deal. But scientists have also found that between 2015 and 2019, that they are the 5 warmest years on record. So the climate pattern is taking shape, that we are seeing this global warming right in front of our eyes. Global warming will continue, and I don't know about you, I've seen a few specials, which is why I have this picture on the bears. And unfortunately, the effects are terrible. You know, the less ice there is up there, the sea lions that they prey on are no longer on the ice and trapped. So the bears are having trouble actually catching the seals. So many of them are starving to death. So while here in the greater Danbury area, if we need something, we can go down to Stu Leonard's or Stop and Shop. When you're out in the Arctic and you're going hunting, when your meal is no longer there, there's not much you can really do. Again, carbon dioxide is our biggest problem that creates the greenhouse effect and is attributed to our concern for the global warming. Parts per million, ppm, is the amount of pollution that's in the air. The Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection reports this number every day. And what we want to do is try to bring these numbers down as much as possible. As long as you are under 50, then your air quality is good. If you go over 50, it's moderate. If you go over 100, then it becomes troublesome for people, especially those that have issues like asthma. You can see the picture on the left. Visibility becomes very murky when you have high levels of particulate matter. And again, this is what we're trying to do. Typically, the worst amounts of particulates are during the summertime, when we're driving the most out on the road, and we want to try to do the best we can to limit the particulate matter in Connecticut. Overall, things are a lot better now because of the stricter mile per gallon requirements by the federal government than they were back in the 70s and 80s. But still, there's more work to do to continue to lower this as we go forward. Again, when you think that China's got so many people and also India, and their population's growing, the more particulate matter they put in the air, the worse it is for everybody. And so that's why there's such a push for green energy. Another concern for it is methane. When you go down to the store and you're buying meat, that effect actually is part of the methane problem. The more that we raise for meat, cattle, the more that the methane is released by raising these animals. So that's why you're seeing a lot more push as you go shopping for natural items to eat for protein as opposed to meat. Again, emissions is the biggest problem that you can visually see. You're driving down White Street and you get some of these older trucks that are just putting out all kinds of particulate matter. While we are concentrating a lot on cars, we need to do more in the truck department to limit these emissions. President Trump tried to lower the standard, but certainly the car companies have been working to not do that, as they know long-term effect that will have on the entire population. So that's a good thing. Fossil fuels such as coal, petroleum, natural gas are all made up of organisms that lived millions of years ago. We are using a lot of fossil fuel on a daily basis. If you're in your house right now, which I'm sure most people are, any plastics are derived from the fossil fuels. So you can see, at firsthand your usage, and also if you are heating your house right now, which I'm sure most people are, despite the fact that the temperatures have been pretty mild. Again, the particulate matter is something that just can't be stressed enough. You go over toward China and Taiwan and stuff, and you've got all this particulate matter in the air. You can just see it on a daily basis. Thankfully, here in Connecticut, we don't have such a situation. The average global temperature has been rising. It's risen 1.62 degrees between 1951 and 1980 on a global mean. The planet's average temperature has increased 1.4 degrees since 1880, and the surface temperature in 2017 was 58.62 degrees. And that's on a yearly basis. Now, what can we do to try to limit things? There was a push during the Obama administration for biofuels. You know, say tonight you went down to Chili's and you had some fried chicken with French fries. Well, that oil that was used to make your French fries and chicken can be recycled. So when you go home at night and you look on your oil tank and you see, oh my goodness, I need oil. You can actually, there's certain companies that now specialize in selling this refined fuel. It may not be a complete biofuel process that they're giving. There may be some actual heating oil mixed in, but we're helping to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are needed to heat your house. And also by recycling that which the restaurant used, you know, it's a win-win situation for everybody. Pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide were about 280 parts per million. And now we're at 800,000. And sorry, we're at the highest level in more than 800,000 years. By sticking in tools into ice in the Arctic areas, they can actually trace, scientists can find out what the carbon dioxide levels were in the past. And that's how they're able to say that, you know, we are at very high levels now to which we have never seen in a long time. Now, ozone is something that keeps living things safe from radiation. I mean, everybody should be wearing suntan lotion when you go outside to limit your exposure to the sun. And certainly the less ozone there is, the more chance for skin cancer. And that's another effect of the shrinking of the ozone layer by the more pollution that we do have in our everyday lives. One thing to be concerned with if you have an ocean home or you live by the shore or your land is very low in elevation, sea level rise. And we are expecting cities like Miami that will see sea rises of about 6 feet by 2100. So they're saying south portions of Miami, like Monroe, Miami-Dade, and Broward, could be underwater. I mean, nowadays you go down there and it's a beautiful location. It may not be there anymore as we go another 75 or 80 years if the sea level rise continues. One thing we want to do to, again, limit our amount of potential gases that we're releasing is renewable energy. A lot of people have made great strides in this, at least in my area where most people are living in individual houses. Solar energy has become extremely popular. You know, it's been a while since I've been in Danbury because of the pandemic. And unfortunately, I don't get around a lot, but I'm sure there's places down there as well that have these solar panels, and it's a great thing. It certainly helps save energy. More than 12% of all energy consumption and almost 15% of energy consumption in the United States is now renewables as of 2016, and that's a 67% increase since 2000. That's probably going to double by 2030 as more people get involved. And certainly that's a great thing. The more we can do, the better. Mitigation is something you want to do. Again, if you have your own house, there's nothing better you can do than go out and plant trees. Seems to be the craze lately because of all the insect damage that we've had and also the snowstorms during October. A lot of damage has been done to trees and people are cutting the trees down. The best thing we can do now is start to replant trees. That's one thing that everybody can do on their own and have some impact. Climate extremes, you know, you're going to end up having a lot of trouble if we continue to see extremes. You know, you expect very hot weather in the sub-Saharan Africa, but when you have extremely hot, dry weather in places like Chicago, you know, you're always hearing about people that are trapped in their apartments suffocating. You know, we can't allow this to continue. We need to do what we can to try to cause the climate change to stop and get back to a more normal state. That's not to say, however, that every time you have a heat wave and every time you have a short winter, that's climate change. There's also some natural variability. Through time, we do have extreme heat waves. We do have very short winters. That's normal. But when it goes on year after year after year, that's when you're having climate extreme and climate change that you have to be concerned with. And again, the floods, the heat waves, and drought are all certainly examples of this. Climate extremes that you can see across the globe: Alaska, second warmest year in 2018, behind 2016. And again, like I said, when you go year after year, well, that's 2 years apart. So that's not a good sign. Also, yearly precipitation across the US in 2018 was the third wettest. Only 2 years were less wet. In Hawaii, we had numerous floods. In the Atlantic, the hurricane season in 2018 included above average activity with the 15 storms, 8 hurricanes. But you have to remember also 2020, which was a historic season for the Atlantic hurricane season. And again, 2018, then you break a record in 2020, you're going in the wrong direction. And also Argentina had its 9th warmest year since 1961. So as you can see on this study from NOAA, there's a lot of change right within the Americas. Climate change in you, what can you do to try to change? You know, the government is the best way to make change. They can do things on a global scale much quicker than we can as individuals. However, as we can all come together and make change, we can make tremendous change, and we have to do that. Again, I go back to the pandemic. You know, if everybody decided not to wear masks, we'd have a lot more cases of COVID than we did. Not that it wasn't bad enough, and a lot more people that were deceased. But if we all step together and make these changes, then we can kind of accelerate the change and not wait for our government to do things. The world population growth has certainly been pretty extreme. It has slowed a bit as some countries like Japan have not been increasing their population as well as the US. So population by 2050 is expected to be 9.8 billion and then 11 billion by 2100. And if we don't go more into the green technology, you can just imagine what's going to happen as we continue to release more gases into the atmosphere. But again, the good news is we're already making changes, and hopefully we're going to negate that. So some things that you can do to limit your carbon footprint: unplug, take a walk. I mean, that's the great thing about Danbury. I love when I'm at WestCon and I need to go somewhere, like to an attorney's office, a lot of times I can just walk. So I just do that, I walk. Recycling, reuse, reduce. Like we had said about the oil in your dinner from Chili's. If you recycle and then turn it into heating oil, that's a great thing. Go green, the more trees you can plant, the better. Shop local. I mean, if you're this time of year, a lot of produce kind of has to be shipped in. But during summertime, when they have native strawberries and California strawberries side by side, the choice should be the local. Your imprint or footprint into the carbon level is much lower when you shop local as opposed to far away when you can. Try to use as much recyclable stuff as possible, biking to work if possible, having solar energy, geothermal, hydro, and wind power. There's a lot of stuff that we can do to cut down on fossil fuels. Wind power, obviously pretty simple. Every time the wind blows, the turbines create energy. And it's something that unfortunately has to be a government thing. Not many people can afford their own wind turbines, but we are starting to see them, especially Massachusetts and off of Cape Cod. There's a big push now for wind turbines. Anytime you've been over there, I know I've been there a lot, the wind's always blowing. It's just like getting free energy. And it's great to see that people are starting to do things like that. Geothermal, you can always get a geothermal heating unit for your house. And it's something that does cost a bit of money, but it's a great way to keep your house cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and use less energy. Hydropower, there are some places that are using it. It is the largest renewable energy source currently used in the United States. It is non-polluting, but it does affect the ecosystem. So it's not quite ideal all the time. Something that kind of surprised me, by trapping heat onto our planet, did you know that the warmer temperatures are linked to a 2% increase in mental health issues such as stress, anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress syndrome? So it's a major concern. Climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, again, heat waves, droughts, and floods. And that's what we're trying to avoid here in Connecticut and globally. You can't just think of yourself, you have to think as a society as a whole across the entire globe. And these changes with the heat waves, the droughts, are going to cause more loss of property and less crops that'll be available. So it does affect society as a whole. Now, our planet provides us with life, and everyone has a right to clean air, clean water, healthy food, and a stable climate. That's the goal of having something to look forward to for our next generations to come. It's not just us, it's 3 and 4 and 5 and 10 and 20 generations from us. We need to take collective actions now to try to make things better for everybody going forward. The youth are certainly leading the way in climate change, and it's a great thing to see. They want it more than others because they see the impact that it's had on other people, older people. So, such as asthma and other illnesses. So they're trying to do whatever they can. And again, renewable energy, a great way to make a sustainable future. And I'd like to thank Bianca Nygren, who is my social media director, who created this PowerPoint for us tonight.
Thank you so much, Gary, for your presentation. Again, we're gonna just give our next presenter, Matthew Casavecchia, just a few moments to get everything situated. But again, thank you for attending this evening. We just ask everyone just to keep their questions towards the end of our discussion this evening. And you'll have a chance to actually ask a questions each to John, Gary, and Matthew. So once again, I'd like to welcome Matthew Casavecchia of the Office of Emergency Management. Matthew, the comm is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Danbury Public Library and my two colleagues that have talked about weather-related issues. I also want to thank the participants, the individuals that have signed up for this interesting educational session. And I appreciate your interest, because it's important that we understand weather, but moreover, from my perspective, what do we do about it? And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes. You can go ahead and advance, Christina. Thank you. So what are we doing here in Danbury to look at weather-related preparedness activities? A lot of things. Weather is top of mind for us. As you can well imagine, many of us experienced this past summer prolonged electrical disruption and outages in our area. And what we have since done is really take a look at how we could get better at responding to the community's needs and protecting the vulnerable populations by working closely with Eversource and other utilities, getting around, getting more apt at responding to these things, so we don't, have a significant disruption of people's lives. We've looked at our operations plans. We've certainly taken a look at our emergency operations center and are revitalizing that. Each year we take a look at what we call THIRA, our threat and hazard identification and risk assessment, and we're going through that exercise now with a number of key stakeholders. None of us would probably be surprised that on the THIRA, we look very specifically at weather and the effects of weather. Moreover, really, flooding and prolonged electrical outages are at the top of the list as far as preparedness and response activities. We've looked at our mass notification capabilities and are looking to improve those by going to a different platform that'll be able to get out to a larger community. The local emergency planning committee is underway, and we're revitalizing that. Just for those who don't know what the LEPC is, it's a joint venture with local businesses and the municipality at really responding to and preparing for a variety of different emergencies, up to including weather-related emergencies. We're in the midst of updating the emergency management web page. That'll be a source of real-time information to the community, and also having the ability to have people take on some preparedness activities that would be really important. We also have the addition of a meteorologist. In our emergency operations center, Gary communicates with me on a regular basis, Gary Lessor, on weather-related activities, and actually does give me the heads up if there's weather that would be affecting us, so we could get our team together and respond accordingly. And finally, we're just completed our National Weather Service Storm Ready program, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Next, Christina. So what is the Storm Ready program? The Storm Ready program is in Connecticut. There's a number of municipalities that have gone through this process. We pay attention to this because of the the deaths and injuries and the economic aspect of some of these disasters that have been weather related. Go ahead and the next. So what's the purpose? Certainly we want to reduce and provide mitigation strategies around this. We want to minimize property damage. And not only that, we've had a number of recommendations on how to improve our response activities and overall improve our community, you folks, on how you could become prepared in the event of a weather-related emergency. Go ahead. So some of the requirements to become storm ready is to establish a 24-hour emergency operations center. The emergency operations center was stood up numerous times in the past 6 months. albeit it has been virtual, but we've learned to kind of communicate in different ways because of the pandemic, among other things. And one of those things is how we disseminate and receive information. And that comes into the many different mechanisms and mediums that we use to communicate among our team, and then certainly to the public as well. In addition to that, we've updated completely the emergency operations plan for the city to address with specificity flooding and prolonged electrical outages. Next. So why should you be prepared as an individual? Well, we often say that emergency services are overwhelmed. In fact, they are. When there is a no notice event, and even with some notice, emergency services has a tough time responding to the numerous requests for emergency services. So the idea of community preparedness and developing a culture of preparedness among the community really resonates with me as an emergency manager, to make sure that the community is prepared and you're the help there until we get there. Sometimes help may not be on the way because of this sheer overwhelming response needs in the community, or we may not just be able to get to you. So we really definitely want the individuals to heed the warnings of public safety in the event that we do opt to evacuate or ask people to move to a safe area. These are really, really important things. And overall, obviously, the goal is to reduce your fear and anxiety, and frankly, ours as well. We don't want to put anyone in harm's way when they ought not to be in that situation in the first place. Next. So the steps to really prepare are pretty simple. It takes a little bit of time. We want you to be informed. Get a plan together. Get a go kit, and look at whatever functional needs that you may have, or perhaps know somebody. It's amazing that there are individuals that are in the community that have specific special or functional needs that don't necessarily take preparedness actions. For example, durable medical equipment that may be compromised when the power goes out. Have a plan to address those things in advance, so your family member and individuals that would be compromised by something like a prolonged power outage will be prepared and be better able to respond should there be an electrical outage. Next. Certainly, we want you to be able to be informed about the various disasters. And John spoke about some of these things. Certainly flooding is top of mind for us in Danbury. And, Gary touched on some of the heat waves. We've had our share of tornadoes. And, several years ago, we had those crazy October storms. In 2018, we had the microburst that wreaked havoc in our area and taxed our services and was responsible for a few deaths in our community as well. So stay informed, make sure you understand, and I think people are getting more and more understanding that the probability of one of these events occurring is seemingly increasing, and it's important to take preparedness efforts in advance to make sure that you and your family are safe and protected in the event that there's one of these incidents. Whether we have some notice or no notice, it's important to be prepared. Next. So part of your plan ought to be, having such things as a family contact, know your evacuation routes, create a network here amongst your friends and relatives and others, your neighbors. Get an inventory of your home possessions, and certainly copy important documents that may be compromised or damaged in the event of a catastrophic natural disaster. Next. Some of the plans also include making sure you have CPR and know how to use a fire extinguisher. We want you to pay attention to, the various mediums that we would be broadcasting specific information and instructions via reverse 911, the radio, television, or from our mayor's office, it's important to pay attention to those specific notices that may be coming out to give specific actions for you to take. Go ahead. This is kind of put this together here on some of the things that may be contained in a disaster kit. You know, it's important to have some of these things for sure. I do want to make sure that people also have medications, you know, at the ready, and you know, pets. We often talk about how important it is to pay attention to pets and have a strategy around your pets as well, to be able to make sure that they're safe and you know, they're taken care of as well. Next. A Go kit really contains a lot of the things I just mentioned about, but here are some of the things here. I'll point out that the extra car chargers for cell phones is a big deal, especially when we lose power for some time. We recommend that I have a full tank of gas and you can plug your phone in. Certainly we've had the ability to stand up some shelters where people can come and charge their laptops or iPads or iPhones, whatever. But having that ability to charge your phone in your car is also important, among some other things I've mentioned here. Go ahead. So, you know, change the items in your kit. Make sure you're every 6 months, make sure that you know how to get in contact with people. Talk about it with your family and include your neighbors in your plan. It's really important, especially if you have elderly or vulnerable populations that are nearby, to check on them. It's all one community. It's all important for us to take care of one another in the event that we have one of these emergency situations which affects our power and other things. Next. Here are some resources that I've put together here for you to recite. The National Weather Service talks in more detail about the Storm Ready program, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has a lot of information for individuals that would want to have a preparedness kit, and just look at some of the other strategies to respond to an emergency on a local level and a personal level. All right, I am going to stop there, and I'm going to turn back to our host. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Now we'll begin a question and answer period. So I ask anyone in our audience to please type in any questions you may have for our presenters in the chat, and I will read it off to which presenter you want to hear from. So again, thank you to all of our presenters for coming out this evening, and also to all of you on this Wednesday evening. So hopefully we got a pretty good perspective of climate change, especially here in our community of Danbury. One thing I wanted to ask Matthew, with the pandemic and also the storms we experienced this summer, how much have we learned, since our resources were so pressed, from the pandemic, and also having a storm on top of that, multiple storms, which actually kind of pushed us to the limit. Did we learn anything from that, Matthew? And are we better from those experiences?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for asking it. So let's talk a little bit about the pandemic, which from my perspective, has been a game changer. We've looked at surge capacity, for example, among our hospital and other hospitals. When COVID was at its highest levels, our capacity was always top of mind. Could we be in a situation where we ran out of resources? So we developed a really robust strategy to communicate among all of our hospitals in Connecticut and New York State to share resources and to create kind of a surge strategy, moving patients between hospital to hospital. So we could provide the level of care which is required, it was a significant strategy that we embarked upon. The other thing is really during the pandemic, the strokes, the heart attacks, the traumatic incidents, they don't stop. They occur. So we have a responsibility to make sure that our emergency department, emergency services are protected. And that surge strategy and movement of patient strategy really was a significant, bolster. It really bolstered our preparedness and capability in the community. With respect to the storms and things that kind of came right in the middle of this, I mentioned in brevity about the idea that an emergency operations center was stood up, but basically everything that we were doing was virtual. This platform, for example, became a mechanism for me and others to communicate with our chief elected official, state officials, and other departments, not only in the state, but at a local level, to be able to respond and share information. Unprecedented, for sure. The other thing historically in the past, when we had power outages, or we would have situations where we'd be considering sheltering was, congregate. We would put people in one space. And that was not a strategy that we could take on for a variety of reasons. With the pandemic, we did not want individuals in a congregate setting in a situation where COVID could be worsened. So our strategies completely shifted to a shelter-in-place strategy, and really leaning on hotels and the university and other places where we could put people in places where there would be some separation, some isolation, if you will. Yet at the same time, we would protect them from the elements, get them out. So it was a game changer all the way around. I will tell you that it was a challenge. A lot of strategic thinking needed to be considered in real time, quickly. But we're fortunate enough to have really good, proactive, seasoned professionals in emergency services, in addition to having subject matter experts like Gary and others where we can lean on to develop weather intelligence for us to respond accordingly.
I agree. I think, despite the circumstances, especially during this pandemic year and the weather incidences that we've had, I think City of Danbury has done above average job all around with meeting this head on. We have some questions from our audience. This one is from Diane, and it's towards Matthew again. The question is, the emergency preparedness plan is great, and I have fire extinguishers, but have no idea how to use them. Would the Danbury Fire Department consider, once the pandemic subsides, holding a session to show us how to use it, and maybe go over which fire extinguishers are good for specific fires, etc.?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. It's a really good one. And you point out the pandemic and what has that's done to our daily life and some of our preparedness activities. We will be reinvigorating the idea of the community emergency response team, or CERT teams, where we reach out to the public, people like you and others, and train them up in a variety of different things: CPR, fire extinguisher utilization, how you could be helpful, not only for yourself and your family, but the community. I will say that it is very likely that once things kind of open up, and they will open up, they will get better, I'm confident of that, we could certainly work with our local fire marshal's office on giving you some good sound advice, practical advice on getting a fire extinguisher. Like anything else, it's a great question. Having a fire extinguisher, much like having a defibrillator on a wall in a school, is great. But if it's just going to hang there and not be utilized in the event of an emergency, it's not a good preparedness strategy. So I applaud your question, and we'll certainly refer you to the fire marshal's office and the community emergency response training, which we should be hopefully opening up in the next several months.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a question. I guess it's towards Gary from Michael. What type of coordination is there between towns, communities in Eastern New York State and elsewhere in Western Connecticut in terms of weather problems?
Certainly, the only outfit that can really handle such a concern would be the National Weather Service. You know, they have all their information that they provide to all the towns within their operation. The good news is in southwestern Connecticut as well as eastern New York State, it's the National Weather Service in Upton. As you work your way into central Connecticut, you have Albany, you have Boston, and Upton. So there's a lot of questions and problems that arise during severe weather. But again, southwestern Connecticut just has Upton, and they do all the coordination. They have protocols to which PowerPoint presentations, every time there's going to be a storm for high winds or flooding, anytime that a severe hurricane will be coming or tropical storm, they put out these basically PowerPoint presentations and go down point by point, how much rain, how much wind, the duration, and exactly what people need to do in the community to be ready for the storm. And I'm sure this is something that Matt sees on a regular basis. I mean, it gets everybody on the same time frame. Everybody knows exactly what to do. And, you know, being a weather-ready community, you understand what all this is about and what they're saying. If you're not a weather-ready community, a lot of times you're not going to understand what they're trying to tell you to do. So it's great that Danbury is taking the initiative to actually work with the National Weather Service and be coordinated. And by doing this, I'm sure there's towns in Eastern New York State that could also be able to work with Danbury and Ridgefield and other towns in Connecticut, that if one community needs resources, they can be shipped across the border.
Thank you, Gary. We have another question from Michael. I guess this may be directed to Matthew. Are the planning and zoning commissions on board with assessing plan development to minimize climate-related issues as much as possible? Like blacktop covering for stormwater runoff, energy efficient housing, etc. And same question about the city's building code. How does it rate in terms of energy efficiency, Matt?
Yes, so it's a great question, and certainly I'll be mindful not to necessarily speak for the Planning and Zoning Commission, but I can tell you that we are definitely tied together as far as information sharing and collaboration. When I say we, emergency management in the city of Danbury and the Planning and Zoning Committee and officials, they actually are on our emergency management list as far as key individuals. So anything that we've done pandemic related, the planning and zoning teams have been right by us. So it really, from my perspective, to answer the question pointedly, yes, they are very much involved in emergency preparedness and emergency response and mitigation efforts, and will continue to be. They were very, very important in developing our entire hazard mitigation strategy for the community. And it's, as you can see, it's very important when we look at vulnerable areas, we look at population and flooding patterns, et cetera. Planning and zoning provides really good information intelligence for us. And we use this information. Gary knows this. We've actually had some exercises in planning out scenarios that we know are a reality based on a situation that Gary has kind of put in his brain and then presented to us. So these are all related to our overall preparedness, response, and mitigation efforts, and recovery for that matter as well.
Thank you, Matthew. Another question from Diane in regards to the certification classes, CPR. Is there a website Danbury residents or can go to at some point to see when the classes are, or at least some sort of contact information?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there will be, and that's part of that emergency management website overhaul that we're working with the mayor's office on now. The information will be present on that as we open things up and as we get more comfortable in having classes. My feeling is, as much as I like the Zoom platform, the CERT program in itself is really hands-on. You know, for example, you really can't, in my estimation, teach someone effectively how to use a fire extinguisher, in this arena. We really need and want people to be hands-on, and that's going to be coming soon. But in short, the City of Danbury's website, once we have that information, would be the place to be able to go there, find out about the program, and when the next class will be.
Thank you, Matthew. Does anyone else have any questions? Maybe especially for John? Maybe there's an interesting anecdote, a story that you can tell us from Danbury history that we may not know of in terms of extreme weather. I don't want to put you on the spot, John, but you're so full of great stories. Maybe you can recall something from Danbury's history that maybe we don't know about.
Well, it's not really weather related, but what I was going to stress too about the city seal. In the city seal, there's the phoenix rising from the ashes, and that refers to the burning of Danbury by the British Army in 1777. Another resilient thing that we had to do was, rebuild the town. But that makes me think of the burning of the Danbury Library in 1996. And again, resilience was called upon to recover from that. And there was a relatively swift recovery because of the outpouring of support from the community. The community really wanted their library back, and they really worked hard to get it back, as the librarians did. And the fire happened at the end of January, and we were back in the main library by September, which I thought was astonishing, considering the damage to the library. But it just shows you the resilience and, the pluck of the people of Danbury. And whoever created the city seal foresaw a lot of these catastrophic events, I think, in some sense too, because the seal, if you look at the seal, it has everything in it already, which is remarkable. They had some knowledge of the future in some way.
That is something I never knew about, John. Thank you. That is something that is, wow, it's right in front of us. Well, we have another question from Diane. This is for you, John. Any massive snowstorms from the past? And I know we've had plenty, but anything that was, historic that you could give some perspective on a Danbury perspective?
The one I would cite is the storm in 1978, which was New England wide. It was not only Danbury, but that storm closed the state for multiple days. And it was really a catastrophic emergency because, again, transportation came to a standstill. People had to dig out cars. The governor had trouble traveling around in the initial stages of the storm. I think that storm was, for this area, the storm of the century in terms of snow. That one was really a critical storm. I would cite that one.
I remember, I was a small kid from back then, but I do recall some pictures of just say 84 people just stuck in cars.
Yes.
And I guess that's why we're like, hey, we're going to close 84. Nobody's supposed to be on the highway, please, especially when we get the call from the mayor saying, hey, please clear the streets of your cars. Please go park them at, Patriot Garage because we need to plow because we don't need these obstacles. And when he says we're going to tow you, some people are like, well, why are you going to tow my car? It's like, well, there's a reason for it. So I guess that is it. Does anyone have any questions for our presenters, Matthew, Gary, and John, before we leave? I'd like to thank you all for attending this wonderful presentation this evening. Just as note, April 14th, we will be having our second part of the ALA Resilient Communities panel discussion, and that's going to be with Sean Fitzpatrick of Real Food Share of Newtown, and we're going to be talking about creating equality in our food system through horticulture, nutrition, and culinary practices. So this is something that I know Danbury is very heavily involved in right now, especially with our food banks. It's just food scarcity, especially during this pandemic year. There are folks that, just may not be able to have access to nutritious food or even have access to food. And if you've driven around Danbury, especially sometimes in the morning, you'll see a long line in front of some of our food pantries and food banks where people go to, get nutritious food for their families. So that is something that I'm proud to see that Danbury has stepped up for that, to make sure that our community doesn't lack the basic necessities such as food. But this is also for April 14th, we're going to be talking about our local farming community and how we can all create a garden where we can actually grow food for ourselves in an organic and nutritious way, and have produce and surplus of that produce enough to share with our neighbors and our friends. So that's something that I think Danbury is on the right path with. So until then, I thank you all for being with us this evening. John, Matthew, and Gary, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
And until next time, I'm Aurelio, also with Christina from the Danbury Library. We bid you good night.